It's a well-established fact that the transition is a vital make or break moment in the swing. In this three-part series, I'm going to share a few of the ways that I use the Swing Catalyst force plate to evaluate and improve the transition part of the swing. In this video, we'll do an overview of transition. In the second video, we'll talk about ways to adjust horizontal force to improve transition. And in the final video, we'll talk about improving transition by adjusting vertical forces. So let's move on to the overview. When I discuss the topic with a player I'm coaching, I tell them to think about the transition the way they would think of a hybrid car. A hybrid uses both gas and electric power. It doesn't use just one. Similarly, the transition includes elements that could be described as being the end of the backswing, and it also has elements that could be considered the beginning of the downswing. Over 20 years ago, I learned a great description of where the transition begins and ends in a full swing. It begins when the lead arm is parallel to the ground on the way back, and it ends when the lead arm is once again parallel to the ground on the way down. Let's move on to discuss the role of each of the forces in transition. For most elite players, the first half of transition includes the ramping up of horizontal force and its peak. The peak of the transition typically happens right around the top of the swing, so another way we could look at it is to say that the peak of horizontal force is the middle of transition. When it comes to torque in transition, elite performers typically ramp up their torque throughout the transition and end the transition at peak torque. Finally, during the transition phase, elite performers both finalize the loading of their vertical force, and nearly immediately afterwards they begin to apply some of that force as well. An observation that I found to be quite useful is the way that elite performers coordinate use of horizontal force with the loading of vertical force. So as we see horizontal force ramp up, at the same time we're going to see a loading of vertical force. The timing isn't always coordinated as precisely as this swing was, but I found that elite players manage these two forces in a way that makes sense. In my opinion, helping players coordinate the way that they use horizontal force as they load vertical force is one of the best ways to improve transition. I call it a fall left move or a fall forward move to capture the idea that two things are happening at the same time. There's a fall, loading of vertical force, and a left, a use of horizontal force. A great way to help players understand what the fall left move is going to feel like is to compare it to other sports. A basketball player would shift forward to shoot, the forward motion, and at the same time they would load downward, lowering themselves into the ground so that they could then push up to make the shot. We could find this movement in many other sports, and doing so helps players find ways to think about it that works for them. Check out the next two videos in this series where we'll discuss horizontal and vertical force in more depth.